Chapter 21. Yun-woo is in our school. 4. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 21. Chapter 21. Yun-woo is in our school. 4. Translator. Editor. Translated by Sean Su. Edited by Sudiao. Transcription. That's the original draft, the imposter insisted. She was probably planning on responding calmly, but she had made a mistake. Joo-ho continued while smiling, I guess you did write it. The imposter became flustered by his words. She finally realized that she had made a mistake, and an implicit sense of anxiety came upon her like a wave. No, it's not over yet, the girl tried desperately to think of a way to escape that situation. Joo-ho continued as if he were trying to comfort her, to someone who isn't familiar with transcribing, they might think that this was the original. Unless you're an enthusiast or an aspiring writer, you wouldn't come to think about copying a book. I told you, this is the original. And I told you, I'm in the literature club. The girl clenched her hands tightly under her desk, and they were turning pale. If he really was in the literature club, he would know. He would know that an original couldn't be that sloppy. He would know that a book couldn't be written from scribbles on a cheap notebook, with no traces of endless anguish and editing on its pages. Still, she kept on, I'm not sure what you're trying to say, but if you're going to be unreasonable, you should leave. No, I will. The girl stood up, rattling her seat. Even then, Joo-ho was still looking down from above. Her pride hurt from having to look up from below. He blocked her on her way out, and she grimaced at him. Her composure was already lost. Joo-ho replayed the events from a moment ago. Along with a crowd blocking the hallway and students keeping their cell phones to take pictures, the students had been impacted by Yun-woo in many other ways. It was only going to get worse. Besides, the imposter standing in front of him didn't seem all that happy anymore. For the first time, someone had cast doubt on her. It was a first-hand experience. Though every person seemed to be worshipping her at the moment, it was certain that there were others who doubted her underneath the surface. It was just that for Seo Kwang and Mr. Moon. The longer she stayed as Yun-woo, the more people's doubts would eventually rise to the surface to suffocate her. Joo-ho looked up to the ceiling for a brief moment and thought, it's probably best for everyone else if I stop her now. He moved aside and let her through. As she walked past him, Joo-ho said, it was a lie that wasn't going to last from the get-go. The girl stopped in her tracks. Joo-ho had calmly declared her end. A lie. It's nothing like that. It's not enough to trick your schoolmates. It won't cut it if you are to handle a name like Yun-woo. Why not? Yun-woo turned around angrily. Her expression was filled with jealousy and a sense of inferiority. What's so great about Yun-woo that I can't handle? He's just an author. People might call him a genius or the youngest author to do this and that, but he's no more than a writer at the end of the day. She bit down on her lips. It was over. She might as well have confessed the truth. Yet, Joo-ho nodded with a smile. You're right. I don't understand why everyone's going crazy. Really? Yeah. Aren't you a fan of Yun-woo? Nope. This guy just agreed with me, the girl thought in midst of surprise. This isn't the end. It's already impossible to trick him. He's the only person who knows that I'm not the real Yun-woo. As long as I keep his mouth shut, I can be rid of this anxiety. Then, can you keep all of this a secret? I don't think so. Joo-ho turned her down immediately, but the girl continued to beg him. How come? I thought you weren't a fan. I never said I dislike him. As she was about to continue, Joo-ho raised his hand to stop her. At that point, there was no point in arguing whether he liked or disliked Yun-woo. He decided to set her free from her illusion. Like I said, this was a lie that wasn't meant to last. You're thinking that you just have to keep my mouth shut, right? But think about it. Do you really think I'm the only person you need to worry about? Her eyes moved restlessly. She was still having trouble understanding, and Juho calmly explained to her the things she would experience. The rumor spread to the teachers too. Your homeroom teacher will be looking for you soon because being Yunwoo is a big plus when moving up to college. You're going to need a document that proves your identity. I'll just tell the teacher that I won't be going to college. Her voice began to shake. Unfortunately, it wasn't that simple. Your photo could be an issue too. Photo? What photo? I've been telling people not to take pictures of me. That won't stop these kids. Do you know how many kids are taking pictures of you from afar without you knowing? They're probably showing it around to their families and friends saying things like, Yunwoo is in our school. I even got her autograph. This is her photo. On top of that, do you think they'll stop at families and friends? If they upload their pictures to the internet, this becomes an even bigger issue. Reporters will come looking for you, and the publishing company will probably want confirmation. You'll come out on the news too. At that point, you'd have already been caught, and then some. A female fellow high school student who impersonated Yunwoo, I just wanted to be Yunwoo. Her face grew more and more pale. No way. That's not true. Yunwoo is a celebrity already. On top of that, he's staying anonymous and refuses every single interview. The reporters are probably dying to talk to him. If your identity becomes known, these people will be in a race to get to you first. Juho wasn't merely trying to intimidate the girl. The name carried real weight and significance in reality. Having just understood the weight of her predicament, the girl trembled in fear. So, you should stop while you can. Your teacher hasn't called for you yet. You haven't had a reporter wanting to interview you either. How can I? Lowering her head, the girl screamed desperately. How can I confess? What would happen to me if I tell everyone that I was a fake all along? It's probably going to be a tad embarrassing. A tad. She was writhing in despair. Being a genius was fascinating. He or she had left behind a beautiful piece of work and received praise from all over. The girl wanted to be a genius like that. One day, Yunwoo suddenly came into existence. Simply put, he was a genius. His work was innocent and pure. Before she knew, she had been captivated by it. Then the girl began to transcribe his book. She had copied everything that could be found in his book onto her cheap notebook. It was hard to believe that her and Yunwoo were the same age. How could they be so different? She was swept into a storm that made her feel inferior and loathsome. So, she ripped up her notebook. She didn't want to live any longer. It was a coincidence that her friend had found her notebook. No, she had actually hoped for it to happen. She wanted the name to be hers. She wanted everyone to think that she was the real Yunwoo. She had left her notebook on her desk on purpose and then left it unoccupied. With the notebook in her hand, the friend asked, "Are you really Yunwoo?" The girl had hesitated, but her friend continued, "I'll keep it a secret. Just tell me." So, the girl answered, "Yes, I'm Yunwoo." It had been thrilling to say those words. This is it. It's all over. Just like that. It had felt so good, but it was all over. The life she knew had crumbled away. It was a disaster. Her hair covered her face as her head lowered itself. It felt like she was surrounded by darkness. It was suffocating. Nobody could live like that. She wanted to jump off the school building. She wanted to run away. She wanted to end her life. Ha ha ha. Laughter. There was sound of laughter. When she looked up, Juho was laughing with his hands on his belly. Is he laughing? Seriously. How can he laugh in a situation like this? Are you laughing because this has nothing to do with you? How could you? I'm even contemplating my life. Over this. It's fine. You'll be fine. What? What is this guy thinking? Does he not know what I've been doing? How can he say that it's going to be fine? You were just so shameless when you were giving out your autograph, so I thought you would have the guts to survive through the troubles of being a celebrity. Autographs. She felt a wave of heat traveling up to her face. Her illusion had shattered, and now she was back to reality. A chaotic storm of shame and humiliation had overcome her mind. I can't tell the truth. I just want to die. As if he were able to see the state of her heart, Juho said, you know that it only gets worse the longer you stall, right? I don't know. I don't care. Juho continued through her confusion, would you like to know why you weren't able to handle living as Yunwoo? What are you talking about? She was already aware of the truth. She didn't need to be told that she wasn't a genius. She didn't want to be. It's because it wasn't your name. It wasn't my name, she asked again, caught off guard by Juho's answer. Yes, he affirmed. It's folly to live under another person's name. Folly. Do you really want to take your own life over something like that? Folly, she muttered after Juho. Folly. Living under another person's name. His words were floating around in her thoughts. Something felt quite empty. At the same time, she felt her burden had lightened. What is this? Was I burdened by something? Her mouth hung idiotically, and Juho laughed again at the sight. Well, you might have to reimburse a handful of people who got their books signed. Oh. And you should expect some people wanting to beat you at night. You might even have nightmares about it. You did do something that was rather stupid. Stupid. Nothing had been solved. If anything, her life was now full of things to make up for. There was not a single piece of good news. I've been stupid all along. Huh, she laughed simply, like an idiot. Mr. Moon went into the classroom to begin his lesson. Class 7, it was the class Yun-woo was in, supposedly. As usual, he opened his book and began his lesson. On the other hand, he was looking around the classroom. Frankly, he was looking at one particular student, Ina Jang. She was the student who was supposedly known as Yun-woo. The mole on her cheek made her stand out among the others. As if she had been told a joke before class, she had been snickering throughout the lesson. The mole on her cheek moved up and down as she did. Mr. Moon called out a student to wake him up from the after-lunch slumber. Then, he asked him to answer a question from the textbook. After some thought, he answered with a mischievous smile, Mr. M, I don't know what the answer is. You should ask Yun-woo. Though he wasn't intending on it at first, Mr. Moon turned his eyes to Ina. He was curious about how she would respond. After thinking for a brief moment, she stood up. I'm not Yun-woo. There was silence. Even the students who were laughing at first began to grasp the situation one by one. Ina continued, I'm not Yun-woo. She wasn't crying or smiling. She confessed as if she were sharing a fact. The real Yun-woo is probably. The real Yun-woo is probably somebody like that guy. Somebody who can change a person's heart in the blink of an eye. Juho-woo was it? Ina thought as she looked around. The students were dumbfounded. Some were fiercely glaring at her as if they had suspected it. There was chaos in the classroom. Ina clenched her fists and stood still. She didn't want to run away from that. You're a psycho. One student said. Ina remembered her. It was the student who had asked for a special note. Psycho. Idiot. Potato. What? Ina decided to stop her foolishness. She lowered head and apologized to the class. I was stupid. I'm sorry. I wanted attention. If I signed your book, bring it to me, and I'll get you a new copy. Again, I apologize. I'm sorry. The class was filled with confusion. Mr. Moon grasped the situation and sighed. He had been somewhat looking forward to meeting Yunwoo in person. Mr. Moon resumed his lesson. Finally, some peace and quiet, Seo Kwang said as he looked out at the empty hallway. Juho agreed. Things had settled down at school since the appearance and the exit of the imposter, at least on the surface. Since it had been revealed that Ina Jiang was not the real Yunwoo, everyone who claimed to be her fan had turned away from her. Among the group were her friends who first called her Yunwoo. Is that girl doing okay? Who? You know, the imposter. Ina Jiang was it. Why do you ask me? Seo Kwang asked back with a confused look on his face, didn't you go to class 7 during lunch? What makes you think that? Juho asked curiously, blinking his eyes in surprise. She confessed in front of her class right after you disappeared during lunch. I thought you had something to do with it. I think you need to base your thoughts on something more solid. I had a feeling, to be frank. It wasn't you though. Though he described his thought to be a mere feeling, Seo Kwang was getting a strong impression that Juho was somehow involved. It might have been that he had a strange image of Juho after his bet with Baron. Nevertheless, Juho gave an affirming nod to Seo Kwang's question. I did go to class 7. Are you serious? What did you do to make her confess? You know, this and that. Juho didn't say much. Being the quick-witted person he was, Seo Kwang rephrased the question, this time, focusing on the present. So, how's she handling the aftermath? It seems like she's reimbursing others for the books she signed for now. Thinking about the kids who were criticizing Ina, Seo Kwang asked again, I saw her eating alone earlier. Aren't you going to eat with her? Juho snickered at him, apparently, she's always been eating alone, even as Yunwoo. She didn't want my company. Of course. I guess she did have the guts to steal Yunwoo's name all along. With his chin, Juho pointed outside, through the window. Wearing her PE uniform, Ina was standing on the schoolyard, and Seo Kwang turned his eyes to her. Who's that? I don't know. A girl who's into special things. Ina was having a conversation with another girl. It was clear that they weren't talking about pleasant things. It looked super serious. The two girls were now scowling at each other. On the other hand, not one person looked away. You never know how a relationship will turn out. What are you saying? They're fighting. They're grabbing each other by the hair. They're going to be famous. Everyone focused their attention at the brawl in the schoolyard. Regardless of their year, a crowd of people gathered around the two in a circle. A few days later, she was no longer eating alone. The end. Chapter 22. Injured, discretion, non-permanent marker. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 22. Chapter 22, Injured, discretion, non-permanent marker. Translator. Editor. Translated by Sean Su. Edited by Sudiao. Word chain, go. Next member. Ha. Me. Although he was caught off guard by Mr. Moon's sudden shouting, Seo Kwang calmly thought of a word. Juho had been just as confused. For someone who started something in such an abrupt manner, Mr. Moon looked peaceful. With a piece of chalk in his hand, he waited for Seo Kwang's answer. Injured. Then Seo Kwang looked at Juho. While observing Mr. Moon's expression, Juho continued after Seo Kwang. Discretion. Then, he looked at Baron, who complained about having to participate and then said, non-permanent markers. *TL note. Would be a permanent marker, but I'm going with non-permanent for the continuity's sake. Okay. We'll stop there. The end of the game was just as sudden as the beginning. Everyone looked at Mr. Moon, waiting for an explanation. Mr. Moon wrote down the 3 words on the chalkboard and then looked at the club members. Starting now, you're going to write something using these 3 words. What? Sun Hwa complained loudly. Although the others kept quiet, their expressions weren't exactly bright either. Even Baron had a surprised look on his face, but as usual, Juho remained composed. Writing based on a suggested topic was a commonly used format in essay contests. Of course, word chain was a lousy method for coming up with multiple topics. Thanks to Mr. Moon's creative approach, the result was complete nonsense. Injured, discretion, and non-permanent marker. Mr. Moon didn't wait for the members to come to their senses. He continued on with his instructions. The time limit is 30 minutes. You'll be writing in prose. 30 minutes. Everyone complained about not getting enough time. Without budging, Mr. Moon explained his reasoning behind that seemingly impossible time limit. This is training to minimize hesitation in your writing. You mean we're not working on our writing style? That's a given. One inevitably becomes a better writer the more he or she writes. The more you write, the better you get. Simple and honest. In other words, whatever the training is, what matters is that you write. I've said this before. The members nodded. They remembered it from their first day. The problem is, writing isn't that simple. You start getting ambitious. You're going to want to write well, but you're not going to know what to write about. Well, maybe it's a little weird to say, you're going to want to write well. I don't really like the sound of that. You won't be able to write a single line. A story came to completion after countless revisions. In order for revisions to take place, there had to be a draft. The very first completed draft. Nobody wrote a perfect draft from the get-go. The members had to complete their first draft with the assumption that there would be revisions down the line. It was not an easy task. So, 30 minutes. There's no time to be idle. Just start writing. Don't worry about fixing things at the moment. You guys are good at procrastinating, right? It is our specialty, Juho answered. Even as the students understood Mr. Moon, they complained all the same, is there enough time to even think? Don't even worry about that. I won't start the timer until you all start writing. That means everyone's timer will start accordingly. Start writing once you've put enough thought into it. As he spoke, Mr. Moon brought out 4 timers from a corner of the room. Now, there was nothing to complain about. Now, begin. At Mr. Moon's mark, the members began to brainstorm. For the time being, Juho wrote down the 3 keywords on the top of his paper. Injured, discretion, non-permanent marker. Everyone had been complaining that 30 minutes wouldn't be enough time, but Juho thought otherwise. If there wasn't enough time, then he simply had to write something short. What do I do? Injured. Maybe there needs to be some sort of an accident. You just had to pick that word, huh? Sun Hwa said to Seo Kwang as he frantically repeated the same word to himself. I think it's better than non-permanent marker. What did you say? Nothing, Baron. As she struggled, Sun Hwa moved her eyes restlessly like she had thought of something. She had thought of a girl who had been stranded. She wanted to write a story about her escape in search of freedom, or discretion. Injured. What if the story takes place in a hospital? The only word left is the non-permanent marker. Non-permanent marker. A girl trapped in a hospital and a non-permanent marker. After a brief moment of thought, Sun Hwa started writing as if she had given up thinking any further. I'm sure things will come as I write, she thought. Her timer started ticking. Bom hurried as she watched Sun Hwa. Struggling to come up with an idea, she looked around the room just as Mr. Moon had previously taught. That moment, her eyes stopped at Baron's sketchbook. Drawing, non-permanent marker, Bom focused her perspective onto Baron's drawing and then dug deeper into her thoughts. The mind was fascinating in the sense that it craved something that the body was incapable of doing. For example, one could feel the urge to go for a run after hurting his leg, or have the urge to draw after hurting his hand. Although she was concerned about whether she would be able to write everything in time, Bom held her pen and started writing. What the, did you all start writing already? You can think all you want. Still, I feel like I'm in a hurry. You're not exactly in a position to be talking either, you know. It was no wonder, considering that Juho hadn't written anything other than the 3 keywords. Juho and Seo Kwang were the only two who still hadn't come up with an idea. Despite that, Juho seemed like he had all the time in the world. As he rushed Juho, Seo Kwang exclaimed, "Ah!" He had thought of something. He had thought of a story that could thoroughly embrace the 3 keywords. "I'll be going now, my friend. You could have waited a little longer." After heartlessly abandoning his friend, Seo Kwang started writing down his ideas in a hurry. What would discretion mean to a student? It'd be absence. Not going to school. The thought alone made his heart beat, but Seo Kwang didn't stop there. There were still 2 other keywords. So this guy writes a letter home on his way out. He uses a non-permanent marker, of course. Then, should I make this about a teenage runaway? If I were to make him injured, a car accident probably makes the most sense. Although he wasn't sure if he was capable of handling such a story, Seo Kwang kept on writing, remembering Mr. Moon's wise words. I can always change things later. I trust you, my future self, he thought. Everyone's working hard, Juho murmured. At the sight all the members lost in writing, Juho slowly picked up his pen. Injured, discretion, non-permanent marker. It was his first time writing with a group of people. Juho was getting excited. He concentrated and then pinpointed the thoughts that were signaling him in his mind. In a brief moment, he began to fill up his page. One day, my parents told me a story of my grandfather, who had passed away before I was born. He was brave and, at the same time, wise. I wanted to meet him, but it was impossible to bring back the dead. So, I gave up. I learned to talk and write. As I read, I learned that there were many types people that exist in a book. The good, the bad, the smart, the foolish, the successful, the unfortunate, the healthy, the sick, young, old, and then those who are alive, and those who are dead. I started writing. It was about my grandfather. He transcended time and space and then overcame death to meet me. Nothing was in my way. Having regards for others was not necessary. I had realized that. Writing is a discretion. It is an immense freedom that ignores various theories and rules. In that case, wouldn't it be possible to share that freedom with another person? I stopped what I was writing and went outside. Outside, thought Juho. What's out there? He reached into the depths of his heart and dipped his hand into his stream of inspiration. Juho knew he'd find what he was looking for in there. He had to write appropriately. It wasn't going to be long from the start, so the story couldn't have too much depth. It would be foolish to tackle it in a hurry. Finally, Juho found what he was looking for. He had to pull it out onto the surface now. Hey! He thought for a moment. He had lost it. Hey! That was disappointing. Juho looked up and saw Sun Hwa. He set aside his dazedness and answered her with a smile. Hey, you called. Did you say snakes have 400 ribs before? She asked. Yes. Apparently, they have more than 400. I see. Thank you. You may proceed. After a brief moment of gratitude, Sun Hwa went back to writing, and Juho thought absent-mindedly, there must be a snake in her story, a snake with more than 400 ribs. He turned his eyes to his paper again. The page was filled with the words he had written up to that point. Although he had just written them, they felt foreign for some reason. It was like looking at food that had gone bad. One was bound to get sick if he ate it. Seeing that Juho had suddenly stopped, Seo Kwang asked, what's the matter? Is something wrong with your paper? No. There is no problem. There was no problem with the paper. Then, Juho heard a conversation between Bom and Sun Hwa. I'm stuck here. How to include non-permanent marker? I'm not sure either. Well, the story is taking place in a hospital, so what if you make a doctor or a nurse use it? That sounds good. They were discussing how they could get around their writer's block. Mr. Moon did not intervene by any means. His intention was to let each writer take ownership of what they were writing. Sun Hwa had decided on a psychiatric hospital as the setting of her story. The comic she had been reading up until recently also took place in a psychiatric hospital. Then, she asked Juho for an outside opinion, and he answered with a question, what do you think about using it as a secret code? A secret code? Yeah. You're writing about an escape, right? You don't always have to treat non-permanent marker as an object. For example, let's say there's a code necessary to escape, and the word non-permanent marker is part of it. It wouldn't be odd to have a secret code or two in a story about an escape. That's kind of cool. That's a great idea. Bom and Seo Kwang answered in sequence. Since when had he been listening? Sun Hwa's face brightened up as she frivolously complimented Juho, you're my muse. I really appreciate that. He waved his hand at her exaggerated expression. The writing writes itself. If Sun Hwa hadn't interrupted him, Juho wouldn't have had that inspiration. Sun Hwa had been the one who had asked for an outside opinion. Besides, no matter how great the story was, translating it into a compelling writing was a different story. They'll do well. They know what they're doing, thought Juho. He slowly moved his pen. As he wrote, Juho noticed that he wasn't feeling the same as he did a moment prior. In other words, there wasn't motivation. There were sounds of pens hitting the surface of the desk. The clock was ticking away. There was a distant shouting from the schoolyard. No matter how hard he tried, Juho couldn't focus. Haha. In the end, Juho wrapped up his story with the protagonist being injured after tripping on a non-permanent marker. After collecting the finished drafts, Mr. Moon left the room. The entire club knew that he had gone to the staff room. Being a teacher was much more than taking care of his or her students. Juho was the only person who had finished his story within the given time limit, while the other three had barely finished their story after begging for extensions. After it was over, it had taken more than 2 hours for Mr. Moon to collect all of the completed drafts. Seeing how he wasn't forcefully collecting the papers, he must have been aware that most of the members wouldn't be able to finish in time. The 30-minute time limit had been a form of device to allow the club members to write continuously and without hesitation. Seo Kwang complained, 30 minutes was really pushing it. I thought it was plenty of time. Shut up. Let's see how well you did. Knowing his product all too well, Juho said no more and shrugged his shoulders. The end. Chapter 23. Elaborate and thorough. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 23. Chapter 23, Elaborate and Thorough Translator. Editor. Translated by Sean Su. Edited by Sudial. Juho stared out of the window of the bus as the scenery rushed past him. Countless publishing companies stood at its destination. Along with publishing companies, there were also tens of print shops and large-scale book distribution companies, all making up one large publishing district. On top of that, there were used bookstores and book cafes throughout. He got off the bus before it arrived at its last stop. He wasn't planning on going to the publishing company that day. Rather, he was on his way to a lunch meeting with his editor. It was definitely around here somewhere. After walking for some time, the sight of a familiar street met Juho's eyes. Just around the corner of that familiar street, there was a small Korean restaurant. In front it, Nam Kyung Park had come out to meet Juho, who was happy to see him. How you doin', Dot? You made it in one piece. Nam Kyung greeted Juho while pushing his glasses up onto his nose. In his mid-30s, he was a capable editor who was responsible for working with several big.name authors. As the two went inside, they were met with other customers having their meals. They walked past them and went into a room with a sliding door. When the door closed, the sound of the outside world faded away. That was one of the reasons why Nam Kyung preferred that restaurant. I guess we won't have to worry about people eavesdropping on our conversation here. Of course. For a restaurant, their walls are thick. Once Juho and Nam Kyung secured a spot, the waitress, who had come into the room with them, brought them a menu. After ordering a light meal, Nam Kyung asked Juho, "So, how are things? Has your cover blown yet?" It was a slightly playful question, and Juho answered with a smile, "I don't even have to try. Nobody suspects me." Haha. I was looking forward to hearing some stories. In that case, I do have a thing or two. Like what? Nam Kyung urged him. He was quite friendly, but at the same time, he wasn't overbearing. It was a proof that Nam Kyung was a skilled editor. Maintaining a relationship with an author was an important part of his job description. When it came to interpersonal interaction, Nam Kyung was exceptional at keeping an appropriate distance. Feeling at home, Juho shared the stories of the things that happened at school. "Kids are scary nowadays," Nam Kyung said in response to Juho's story about the fight between the two girls. His eyes were filled with interest. "How about you? Do you have anything? You want to hear a story about working overtime?" It was a roundabout way of saying that he didn't have a story. He added that working overtime as an editor was as normal as daily meals. "I just came from proofreading a draft up until a moment ago." "You spend a lot of time doing it, don't you?" "I can't stand misprints." Nam Kyung was strangely obsessed with misprints. There were always flaws in all books. There were times when the wrong word ended up getting used. There were times when a typo ended up in the final print. Although books went through tens of inspections, there was always something that had been overlooked. Nam Kyung was tormented whenever he found such oversights. For that reason, he spent more time and energy into proofreading. The recent trend among publishing companies was to outsource the proofreading process. The editor's responsibility started at project planning and coordination. In other words, there was enormous workload. There was a limit to how much a single editor was capable of achieving. Yet, Nam Kyung would always say, "I want to make books that are both elaborate and thorough." Even then, there will always be misprints. People made mistakes, and books were made by people. It was inevitable to find misprints in a book. Everyone writhed in pain at first, but soon came to terms with the reality. However, Nam Kyung was adamant. "That's why you keep proofreading until there are no more misprints." Juho felt secure as an author to be working with an editor like him. "You work so hard." "I'm still single, thanks to my work," Nam Kyung complained light-heartedly. Even for somebody whose dream was to make books both elaborate and thorough, working overtime was deeply undesirable. "Your meal's ready." The sliding door opened, and the waitress put down her tray. Along with various side dishes, Juho's tofu soup and Nam Kyung's pollock stew had been placed on the table. An intoxicating smell wafted into Juho's nose, and the two picked up their spoons. "This is great." "Right." Juho exclaimed after taking his first bite, and Nam Kyung answered with a proud expression on his face. He seemed happy about bringing in another satisfied customer to his favorite restaurant. As they ate quietly, Juho suddenly thought of something that Nam Kyung had said in the past. "Wait. Now that I think about it, didn't you say you worked with Hyun Do Lim in the past?" "Yes, I have," Nam Kyung reminisced as he shoved a big spoonful into his mouth. He remembered how nervous he was when he met the author for the first time. "Why do you ask? Are you a fan?" If he put it that way, then perhaps. He was incomparable as an author to Juho in terms of both experience and skill. I'm in the middle of transcribing one of his works. I just thought I should ask. Transcribing? Nam Kyung asked as if it were unexpected. Soon, he nodded as an expression of acceptance, but there was still suspicion in his face. Authors often transcribe as well. I see. You transcribing Hyun Do Lim's book. What's with your expression though? Nam Kyung thought for a brief moment and said, I just had a thought that you and Hyun Do Lim might fall under a same category. What do you mean? Nam Kyung started telling his story about the author. Mr. Lim is. How should I describe him? He is very delicate, yet broad-minded and friendly. But rough around the edges at the same time. That description. You should be an author. I know. All in all, he's a respectable figure. Juho knew that much. Reading his book had always aroused a sense of respect in him. What had Nam Kyung's meant by putting him and Mr. Lim into the same category? If he had meant it as a compliment, he would be incredibly overestimating. But you're not. Is that right? It was a relief and a pity at the same time. Except for one thing, if we're talking about similarity between you and Mr. Lim. If. There was a prolonged silence. In the meantime, Juho had another spoonful of his soup. It was smooth and spicy. I'm not too sure. Why would you even bring it up then? Juho murmured silently. I can't pinpoint it, but I have a feeling. I can only explain it as an editor's intuition. That was disappointing. You should stick to being an editor. I appreciate that. Throughout their meal, Juho and Nam Kyung talked about the decrease in the reading population or a certain publishing company going out of business. So, are you still against having your book made into a show or a movie? Yes, while helping himself with side dishes, Juho answered and stopped in his track. That was one of the topics that had come up while the two were making plans for lunch over the phone, which meant that there was a studio interested in purchasing the copyright. Since he was already aware of the outcome, Juho declined at once. Nam Kyung said quietly, if you agree to it, your book will be made into a motion picture. There will be famous actors playing the major characters. It's a book written by Yun-woo, so they'll really make sure not to mess with the original too much. They'll invest a lot of money into it too. Nam Kyung was obviously trying to lure Juho in, but Juho answered with a smile, it's not easy to adapt a novel. At Juho's rigid attitude, Nam Kyung immediately changed his posture as he murmured, I knew you weren't as immature as you let on. This is really a mouth-watering opportunity from the promotional point of view. I didn't know that my book needed publicizing. It's already doing really well, Juho answered light-heartedly, but Nam Kyung returned with a serious face. There's no end to corporate greed. You need to ride the wave while your book is doing well. Marketing. Juho fully understood Nam Kyung's perspective. Of course, promoting a product was an essential element of sales. That was no different in the publishing industry. If anything, the power of marketing was much greater in publishing. That was the reason why editors built relationships with bookstore employees in an offline capacity while putting up with incredibly temperamental literature merchandisers online. That also applied to gaining exposure for a book. It was common for a publishing company to compete for the most visible spot in the bookstore. Some companies even paid bookstores for a display stand. The amount ranged from hundreds up to thousands. The online market was exactly the same way. It was crucial for online bookstores to work with a merchandiser because they had the ultimate authority in terms of exposure. It was a struggle to earn the title of merchandiser's recommendation. That title spoke louder than any other form of advertisement. It was an opportunity that no publishing company could afford to lose. For that reason, there was an obvious contractual relationship between a merchandiser and a business, which explained the occasional buying spree controversies. Once a book entered into the bestseller ranking, there was a noticeable increase in sales as well as promotion. Juho was well aware of that situation, and he had a reason to turn down the offer to adapt his book. They're not adapting the story in its entirety. Once the story is made into a screenplay, things are bound to be taken out. I don't really know how the director will interpret my book either. The thought makes me uneasy. I guess you have a point. I'm sure they'll emphasize the romance. You don't know that. Don't you think you'll have a better idea once you talk to these people in person? Nam Kyung asked. He wasn't aware that Juho's decision was based on his life experience. He had said the same thing in the past, you'll know better once you talk to these people. However, that wasn't true. This is when my age works as a disadvantage. Back then, Juho's mind was as old as his age, 17. Communication had not been possible between an adult who's a skilled negotiator and the 17-year-old Juho. The studio was a well-known company with several major works, so Juho's expectation had been through the roof. It had been like a dream to have real actors performing the story that he wrote. However, the result had been far from his expectations. In the end, The Trace of a Bird had left a legacy as a failed example in novel cinematization. Unlike his usual self, even Nam Kyung had had a bitter expression on his face then. As a book enthusiast himself and the editor in charge of the book, he must have felt terrible. If it's a request made by the author himself, they'll listen. If dealing with adults is too much for you, I can go on your behalf. I don't know, Juho answered vaguely. I'm not really looking to make things complicated either. Although the situation was different this time, Juho wasn't really looking to make any demands. Even if he decided to actively involve himself in the production to make sure the movie did well, he felt that he wasn't going to be genuinely happy. Well, maybe things could be different if a director approached him saying that he wanted to try to make The Trace of a Bird into a movie with all his heart. That would probably never happen, however. I'm sorry to say this, but I'm not interested. It's your work. There's nothing to be sorry about. Recognizing that he couldn't convince Juho, Nam Kyung brought the water cup to his mouth. He must have been doing a lot between Juho and the publishing company. Juho turned his attention to his tofu soup and slowly finished his meal. Done. Yes. How about a cup of coffee before you go? I'm always up for that. After paying for the meal and the dessert, Nam Kyung went back to his work. On his way, he groaned in misery at having to work overtime again. The end. Chapter 24. Language Acquisition Device. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 24. Chapter 24, Language Acquisition Device Translator. Editor. Translated by Sean Su. Edited by Sudiao. Before returning home, Juho decided to make a brief visit to the bookstore. There was something he needed to buy. On his way to a bookstore nearby, a foreigner caught Juho's eyes. Her antsy behavior made it obvious that she was lost. Whenever she tried to reach out to talk to someone, people would walk away in a hurry. If things had been anything like how they used to be, Juho probably would have done the same. However, with the language acquisition device in his head, Juho was now able to face that foreigner's language with confidence. Do you need help? He asked the foreigner in English. Her eyes sparkled upon hearing her native tongue, and the foreigner answered back in English, yes, please. I'm looking for a lodging location named Arabia, but I have no clue on how to get there. One moment. Juho had never heard of the place. After a brief moment thinking, he led the foreigner into a nearby real estate office. A drowsy employee jumped out of his seat at their presence. Could you give me directions to a lodging location named Arabia? Yes. One moment. The employee searched for something in a hurry. Upon finding the place, he pointed to the location using a map on the wall. Juho translated simultaneously as the employee explained how the place could be reached and felt the employee staring at him in amazement. Oh, I know this place. It was across that one grocery store. I've been walking around this area in a circle. The foreigner smiled brightly. She must have been scared of getting lost in a foreign country. Have a great trip. Oh, thank you so much. This is why I can't stop traveling even though I get lost every time. Saying that a helper could always be found, she went on her way after thanking Juho. He waved as she turned around. The brief relationship had come to an end, and Juho too made his way back to the bookstore. The large bookstore was booming with people. He walked past the long line of people waiting for their turn at the cashier. The trace of a bird was on display on the first rack that crossed Juho's eyes. People standing in front of the rack were examining the book. After watching them briefly, Juho turned back. It had been a while since he had been to a bookstore. Wanting to peruse, Juho walked over to the literature section. The books were divided by the authors' names, and they were all famous writers. As he scanned through the books, Juho stopped in front of one author's name, Dong Gil. Right next to it was another author named Seo Jong-on. The bookstore might have placed them very close to each other deliberately. Those two authors were a renowned duo in the literature world. Their history went back to their birth. They were born 2 months apart in the same neighborhood and went to the same school throughout elementary, middle school, and high school. Dong Gil had revealed in his essay that he and his friend Seo Jong-on had been in the same class 6 times in the past. Their path seemed to finally split in their college years, but Seo Jong-on ended up getting thrown out of his dorm. In the end, he stayed at Dong Gil-um's house through university. Now, those two friends were working in the same field as authors. Both had become successful in their profession, and their friendship was truly inseparable. Juho had read a novel that had been company written by the two authors. It had been a popular read then, and that had been rightfully so. Juho had enjoyed it a lot. Written by two polar opposite people, that book had brought about a sensation that was both hot and cold. Dong Gil. Juho had read his work quite a bit when he had been older. Most of his books were based on true events, and his expressions, too, were realistic. His satire was honest, cold, and sharp. His style was both concise and masculine. Once in an interview, Dong Gil had revealed that he looked up to Ernest Hemingway. Juho picked up a book and felt the coolness of the cover. The book was named Genius. Though he had planned on looking at it briefly at first, he ended up buying the book out of impulse. He walked into the specialized section. On the floor, there was a person sitting down, reading. Juho walked past his legs and kept on walking. The shelves were divided into categories. After scanning through them one by one, he eventually found the words he had been looking for. Original language. There was no one around. Because it was in the inner part of a section, the original language shelf was shaded by the surrounding shelves. The books were in various languages, and the section gave off a secretive vibe. Perhaps, it had something to do with the shelf being in the shade. English, Chinese, Japanese, French, Spanish, German, Latin, Russian, Finnish. These books were written in a wide variety of languages. Some were written in languages that weren't as well known, like Welsh, Scandinavian, Gothic, and Lombardian. Juho had the urge to buy each and every one, but he had made up his mind to limit himself to 3 books. After some contemplation, he picked up a book written in Japanese. There were adorable characters on its red cover. Thanks to that book, the secretive vibe of the section vanished completely. In the first page, there were katakana and hiragana. Click. There was a sound in Juho's head as soon as he began reading the book. It was the sound of a button being pushed. The device began to work. The next page, and then another page. The pace of the turning pages was picking up, and Juho's device was acquiring the universal grammar of the Japanese language. Hello. Nice to meet you. Did you eat? Waste of resources. Destruction of the environment. What is your opinion? What day is it today? It's a holiday. It's snowing out. Clear skies. Have a seat. Should we have a drink? I'm in a good mood. Thank you. As Juho murmured random phrases in Japanese, the man reading on the floor glimpsed over at him. Ignoring him, Juho engulfed himself in the fascinating sensation in his head. It was like smelling with his nose. The language acquisition device detected the scent of a language. It was a natural process. Juho pulled out another book from the shelf. German. The book had been written specifically for travelers, Guten Tag. From basic greetings to flight, lodging, restaurants, shopping, transportation, phone and emergencies, the book was organized into categories. Click. There was that sound again. Juho tried to focus his attention at his head. It somewhat felt like there was heat radiating from his temple. After reading through several books, Juho picked up 3 of them. They were in German, French, and Spanish. He planned on learning as many other languages as he could. The cashier was quiet, and Juho paid for his books without much trouble. Mr. James. I'm here to get your stuff. Juho went into the English class. It was a class being taught by James, the native English instructor. Since the centipede incident, Juho had started talking to James frequently. After discovering, in the process, that Juho was extremely interested in the English language, James told him that he would provide him with resources on medieval and Old English, and Juho gladly accepted his offer. Give me a moment. I'm in the middle of transferring the data. It's almost done, James answered him in a natural English. He was already aware of Juho's level of skill. In response, Juho replied in English, sure. Do you think I'll be able to pick it up before club activities? Of course. Here, done. He handed back the flash drive he had borrowed from Juho. In the flash drive, Juho would probably find the history of the English language that James had studied as a student. He picked it up with a grateful heart. If you get stuck, come find me. I did put in some notes, but it's still not an easy read. Great, thank you. You don't have to thank me. Now, I feel like an actual teacher. Dealing with drowsy students is so boring that it makes me yawn, James said as he pretended to yawn. It was an exaggerated gesture, but Juho saw a resemblance with someone in his struggle of developing an affection for school life. Are you close with Mr. Moon by any chance? He helped me out a few times when I was studying Korean. We ate together too. The pork belly was delicious. It was slightly amusing to picture the two grilling together. James lowered his voice and asked Juho discreetly, did you know that Mr. Moon hates boiled carrots? I saw him separating them from his food and setting them aside. Boiled carrots. He hadn't seemed like a picky eater. That was unexpected. I made fun of his appetite, and he got angry, asking where I had learned to say things like that. Thanks to him, I learned a new verb in Korean. What an amazing teacher. As James was about to continue, the door opened. Juho turned around and saw Mr. Moon standing with a stack of printer paper. I guess he's not all that gentlemanly. Like after all, he thought. Hi. Mr. Moon, why come here? Following Juho's greeting, James asked Mr. Moon with his slightly awkward Korean pronunciation. After looking at the two, one after the other, he waved the stack of papers in his hand. The printer in the staff room isn't working, so that's why I'm here. What are you doing here, Juho? Isn't it time for club activities? I'm here to learn English. I don't recall you being so diligent. You never came to me, and I never saw you in the staff room. There he went again with his blunt remarks. I'm interested in the English language. Mr. Moon seemed to be surprised by Juho's answer. At that moment, James spoke up, Juho is a hard-working student. He's highly skilled in the language. He has a deep understanding of the English language. He speaks with me mostly in English. Is that so? I had no idea. What do you guys talk about usually? There's really no preference from our daily lives to current events. At times, we talk about the centipede that we let go out into the backyard. He's very fun to be around. Mr. Moon said as he rubbed his chin, then I must have heard it right when I heard my name come up. Mr. Moon's words. I don't understand. What? James was at loss of words. It was one of those moments when his Korean was put to the test. Joo-ho decided to leave the room to not be a hindrance between the two. As he attempted to sneak out, Mr. Moon caught him like a hawk and said, "You were on your way to the science room, weren't you? Let's go together." "Yes, Mr. Moon." Until Mr. Moon finished with his business, Joo-ho kept fiddling with his flash drive in his pocket. As Mr. Moon and Joo-ho went on their way, James said brightly, "Come again. Take care." After nodding lightly, the two went out to the hallway. It was quiet. The students had already gone into their respective classrooms. Joo-ho had lost track of time talking to James. If Mr. Moon hadn't shown up, he would have been late. I should be careful from now on, thought Joo-ho. While walking quietly, Mr. Moon spoke up, "I read your paper. There was a lot of character and personality in the end." "Was there?" Joo-ho answered as if he didn't know. "You must have experience writing." "Pardon me. There's stability in your sentences. There's no awkwardness, especially in longer sentences. That's impossible to accomplish unless you're an experienced writer." "Well, I suppose it could be possible for a prodigy." Joo-ho hesitated. The end. Chapter 25. Focus till the end. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 25. Chapter 25, Focus till the end. Translator. Editor. Translated by Sean Su. Edited by Sudiao. Joo-ho carefully observed Mr. Moon's expression. He didn't seem to be suspicious of him being Yun-woo, and Joo-ho slowly opened his mouth. "I enjoy writing quite a bit." "Did you learn to write professionally?" "No." "Do you read a lot?" "I do read frequently. Though, I don't read nearly as much as Seo Kwang. He's excessive even in my eyes. It's more like a sickness." Their footsteps echoed throughout the hallway. By the time they had arrived in front of the science room, Mr. Moon said, "Well, today, try working on your conclusion a little bit more." Then, he flung the door open. With the exception of Joo-ho and Mr. Moon, everyone was already sitting down, and they all stared at them. As Joo-ho went to his seat, Seo Kwang said, "I was wondering why you were running late." "I see that you came with Mr. Moon." "Yep. We ran into each other on the way." In front of Joo-ho's seat was the paper he had written previously. He skimmed through the pages for any written annotation of sorts, but the pages were left untouched. Mr. Moon said, "I enjoyed reading through your papers. Nobody here seemed to be inept. You all exceeded my expectations." "Inept? You can be inept at writing, just like with dancing and singing," Mr. Moon answered Seo Kwang rhythmically, and he quietly accepted Mr. Moon's answer. "Seo Kwang, you read more books than anybody in this room." "Yes, that's right," he answered proudly. It was a matter of pride for him to read regularly and in large quantities. In midst of Seo Kwang's proud moment, Mr. Moon shared his thoughts on his paper, "Because you read so much, your writing skill is pretty decent. It's just that your story tends to be boring at times." "Really? Try focusing on the dynamics of your story. Whether the story is moving continuously or the climax persists throughout the entire story, it's going to be boring either way." "Yes, sir." Mr. Moon moved on to Sun-hwa. "Sun-hwa, I liked that your story unfolds without holding back, but it was too much. There were too many details left out for the reader to be able to follow with ease. From now on, try to consider the reader's perspective more when you write." "That was too much." "Yes, Mr. Moon." She seemed confused by Mr. Moon's comment, but Joo-ho had a slight idea as to what her paper must have been like. Her story probably moved along in large intervals. The gaps were probably too large for the reader to catch up to the story. Mr. Moon turned his eyes to Bom, who was sitting next to Sun Hwa. Bom. You've hit an average mark overall. Your sentence structures and plot weren't too bad. The only issue was that you tend to go overboard with your descriptions in places. Try not to get lost in your own emotions. Yes, Mr. Moon, Bom answered timidly as she nodded. Sun Hwa cheered for her friend for her generally positive review. Juho clapped along. Bom blushed and waved her hands. She was quite the shy girl. Now, Juho. Yes, Mr. Moon. You need to focus till the end. The ending must have been quite disappointing. As if it hadn't been enough for him to comment on it the first time, Mr. Moon emphasized the ending of Juho's paper again. Yes, yes. I'll work on it, he thought. And Baron, nice drawings. Yes, sir. After concluding with compliments on Baron's drawings, Mr. Moon spread out the stack of paper he had had with him since the English class. There were 5 pages in total, and they were all different. Only, there was one common word between the pages. Essay contest. They were brochures for an essay contest. They contained information regarding the essay contests that were being held in various places. Are we going to be competing in an essay competition? Of course. You're in the literature club, for goodness sake. Everyone's faces lit up as they looked at the brochures. A contest was always accompanied by anxiety and excitement. There are different types of competition. What it looks like really depends on who's hosting it, including the topic and the format. Some give out an award just for writing your name, whereas others offer a cash prize. Cash! Seo Kwang exclaimed with excitement. In some cases, bigger competitions offered a large amount of cash to the grand prize winner. It's up to you to choose the type of competition you want to participate in. But, whatever you sign yourselves up for, there's a contest we all have to participate collectively. A mandatory contest. Where's that? Bom asked, and Mr. Moon spread out his index and pointed to the floor. The school competition. Ah! There were sounds of realization. When is it? The exact date hasn't been decided yet, Mr. Moon answered Juho. You guys are familiar with the format. Remember the assignment where you had to use 3 keywords to write something? Were the topics really injured, discretion, and non-permanent marker? There will be different topics, and you'll have to choose one that you want to write about. This is actually a lot easier than your previous assignment. It sounds like it. It did sound a lot easier than having to utilize 3 words that had nothing in common. What a surprise. Who would have thought he had even been thinking about competing in an essay contest? On the surface, Mr. Moon appeared to be doing just enough to get by, but he had a thorough side to him. Sun Hwa interjected and asked, are there prizes? Of course. Mr. Moon continued before anybody had the chance to get excited, but there's only one winner per class. Juho hesitated at Mr. Moon's words. 1 winner per class. He turned to Seo Kwang automatically, and he, too, was looking at Juho. Are we having a showdown? The words didn't sound like they came out from Seo Kwang's or Juho's mouth. Sun Hwa, who was sitting right across from them, had said it. Thinking about it, Bom was in the same class as her. Showdown, huh? That sounds dignified. What? It is a showdown. You two should compete too. It's fun, Sun Hwa answered Juho after hearing his murmur. At that moment, an unexpected competitor quietly joined in, sounds good. Should we make a bet? It was Baron, who quietly emphasized the idea of betting. Come on, Baron. We're still students. Juho snuck himself out of the group, but the others joined in on Baron's suggestion with excitement. They just didn't know better. Yeah, let's make a bet. Loser buys something for the winner. Oh, come on. I'm not into things that cost me money. Seo Kwang's face bittered as he appealed to his financial situation. Is it because you're afraid somebody might ask you to buy them a house? Oh, no. You got me. Guys, let's discuss this in peace. BOM stopped Seo Kwang and Sun Hwa as the tension rose. After listening to everyone, Mr. Moon added, the winner gets a fried chicken from me. Juho laughed on the inside. Who would compete for that, he thought. Yet, as if mocking his thoughts, the science room exploded in loud, excited voices. Yes. Sweet. Wow, fried chicken. Even Bomb's face was lighting up. The response was tremendous. With Juho at a loss for words, Baron raised his hand, am I getting that prize too? Sure, if you win an award. At the bewildering conversation, Juho asked him, Baron, are you planning on writing? I've done it once, and I can do it again. Besides, it's fried chicken. Oh, yes. That's what I like to hear. Among the members united by fried chicken, Juho found himself feeling left out. Wow, they're going crazy over fried chicken. They were still kids after all. For a moment, Juho reminisced about his past. He thought about a sports day in elementary school when the entire school competed for a whole pizza. Okay, that's enough. If you want fried chicken, you know what to do, right? Are we doing word chain again today? Sun Hwa asked, and of course, Mr. Moon nodded. Until it gets old. Maybe we should play a syllable game next. Why a game? Seo Kwang asked. I wanted to prove that even a word that came out as coincidence can be turned into a writing prompt, even if it came out during a game. I'll show you that every word in existence can be turned into a composition. I see. After accepting his answer, the members thought in unison that Mr. Moon was going to unnecessary lengths to prove his point. At that moment, Mr. Moon shouted the first word, pot. Ha! What the? Okay, pot. Tree pipit. Think wisely this time. Asterisk TL's note. Again, different words for continuity. Asterisk Sun Hwa pointed to Seo Kwang as the next contestant. Although he knew that anything he said could be an ingredient for writing, Seo Kwang prioritized driving other birds out of his mind. The game wasn't about birds. Trumpet. He looked at Juho as if everything was in his hands then. Without hesitation, Juho said the first word that came to mind, Tarzan. It had been decided. The three keywords for the members to write about were tree pipit, trumpet, and Tarzan. While BOM laughed awkwardly, Seo Kwang murmured with disappointment, Tarzan. Why Tarzan of all things? Should I just write about Tarzan playing the trumpet while he hangs out with his buddy Tree Pipit? What are you, E.R. Burroughs? E.R. Burroughs was the author of Tarzan. With a big smile, Juho answered the dejected Seo Kwang, I'm not quite at the level to be on par with E.R. Burroughs. Tarzan playing the trumpet, hanging out with his buddy Tree Pipit. It wasn't half bad. That story is actually not half bad. Yeah. It's not. At Mr. Moon's mark, the members picked up their pens. Brainstorming was essential. Everyone pictured the story they were going to portray. While others were busy mapping out their story, Juho was the only person who had began writing. Tarzan, trumpet and Tree Pipit. Juho started with the word that came out of his mouth. Let's say there was man who introduced himself as Tarzan. He was so moved by the novel, Tarzan, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs, that he decided to be Tarzan himself. Juho observed the character from a distance. That was so that he could strike a balance between emotional and rational perspectives. The man thought to himself, Tarzan's friends are animals. Let's think of some animals, Juho thought. The man went outside. The only animal he saw was a tree pipit. A tree pipit here, a tree pipit there. He wandered about the streets in search of gorillas, snakes, and elephants. There were only people. People after people. The man came to a realization. That was not the jungle. That place was different from a jungle, where all sorts of creatures came together and mingled. Where the man lived, there were only people. The exhausted man found a trumpet in a pile of trash. As soon as he blew on it, it made a sound. He couldn't communicate with the instrument, but it had been a beautiful sound. He blew the trumpet once again, and the trumpet answered immediately. When Juho had written up to that point, he felt a piercing gaze from someone. He peeked around and found out that Mr. Moon was looking in his direction. He remembered what Mr. Moon had emphasized in his comment about his writing, the ending. Others were still in the beginning stages of their stories. They were much calmer in comparison to the previous time, so Juho put down his pen for a moment. He took some time to think about how he was going to wrap up the story. The ending, the ending, the ending. Juho couldn't think of anything and sighed internally. It was a feeling all too familiar to him. Juho acknowledged to himself that he was being too conscious of the readers. It felt like when he wrote his second book, and he didn't have to try to remember the result. In the end, Juho was the last person to submit his paper. Haha. He wrapped up the story by a starving Tarzan choking to death while eating boiled carrots. Sorry, Mr. Moon. The end. Chapter 26. A harsh, bitingly cold winter. 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 26. Chapter 26. A harsh, bitingly cold winter. 1. Translator. Editor. Translated by Sean Su. Edited by Sudiao. Man, I'm tired, Juho said as he stretched out his arms towards the ceiling. Since the contest had been announced, he had started writing in various styles. Portraying characters' faces from their respective point of views, describing an object's texture, setting a rock as the narrator of the story, describing the feelings of grass, and more. In the case of the story about the grass, the plot was mostly made of motion sickness. Some days, Juho experimented with a story entirely made of short, tempered characters. Stories like that were like time bombs, ready to blow at any minute. Since there wasn't enough time for transcribing anymore, the transcription assignment had become an optional homework. There was no punishment for not doing it. Yet, every member in the literature club chose to transcribe at home to improve their writing skills. That day, the literature club was busy writing as always. Everyone seemed spaced out from exhaustion. Juho massaged his shoulder and groaned involuntarily. As he moved on to the other shoulder, Sunwa let out in a depressed tone, I'm afraid of reading what I wrote. I've been finding out more and more how much my writing actually sucks. It's embarrassing to read your own writing, Baum agreed with her. A piece of writing that came into existence no more than a few minutes prior came back to haunt the writer as an unbearably embarrassing past. One often felt the urge to lock it away for eternity, and Sunwa wanted to write everything all over again. We have to push through. If we start revising now, we won't be able to finish it in time even if we have 3 years, Seo Kwang said weakly. If you're seeing how your writing could have been improved, then it also means you're learning how to write better in the future. Don't be so ashamed, Juho encouraged the two people who were writhing in shame. Regardless, there was little effect. Sunwa looked at her draft, feeling dejected. Yeah, you're right. But it doesn't take away from the embarrassment, she said as she slammed her draft onto the desk. Man, I wanted my story to be prettier. My mind gets so hectic whenever I start writing. Juho smiled faintly at her rant. It was a good mindset to have. A writer had to be aware of his own greediness more than anything else. It didn't mean that they shouldn't be possessive either. When writing, one had to focus on writing alone. The moment their greed took over, the writing would naturally lean toward pleasing the reader. It would dress itself in bright colors. It would become clouded by obscure jargon while the exploration within the story turned excessive. Wearing too much makeup would damage the skin. It was the same for writing. It got damaged by disingenuity. That was how a piece of writing became pretentious. Russell. BOM reached into her bag and took something out. It was chocolate. The literature club was flexible about bringing snacks. For that reason, the members often snacked on sweets after they finished writing. Wanting to share, BOM handed out her chocolate. Each single piece of it was wrapped, so it was easy to eat. After thanking BOM, Juho popped the chocolate into his mouth. There was an explosion of sweetness. It felt rejuvenating, and everyone sat up in their seats. BOM brings the best snacks. I feel much better. Pretty good. Sun Hwa, Seo Kwang, and Baron said in order, and Bom smiled brightly. Juho opened the window of the science room to let out the sweet smell of chocolate. A pleasant breeze rushed into the room, and he stood in front of the window for a moment for some fresh air. That moment, Juho turned around at the rustling sound. BOM was picking up the wrappers spread across the desk, so he helped her. It's okay, I'll just finish it, she said. Juho answered by folding one of the wrappers into the shape of a notepad. It'll be quicker if we do it together. Juho and BOM picked up the chocolate wrappers from the floor. When Juho looked up, he found Seo Kwang and Sun Hwa with wrappers in their hands. Baron was doing the same. Since there weren't that many, all the wrappers were picked up in no time. Rock, paper, scissor, somebody suggested as a way to decide on a person to take out the trash. Although BOM had volunteered, the game had already started. Juho joined in. In the end, BOM took part in it as well. Rock, paper, scissor. Ah. Yes. Seo Kwang lost, and Sun Hwa gladly saw him out. He walked out into the hallway mumbling, and Juho also waved his hand at him. When Seo Kwang came back, he was accompanied by Mr. Moon. After getting a piece of chocolate from Juho, Mr. Moon said as he was chewing on the chocolate, "Now, I'll teach you how to polish your writing. You finally get to revise all the embarrassing things you've been writing so far. Doesn't that make you happy?" Sun Hwa cheered. It was at least 10 times more effective than Juho's encouragement. Seo Kwang and BOM also welcomed Mr. Moon. While watching the members' response, Mr. Moon questioned Juho, who was sitting quietly in his seat, "Aren't you happy?" "I am," he answered quickly. "Now, shall we begin?" Without hesitation, Mr. Moon began to write out an example on the chalkboard. As usual, it was an abrupt start. Juho Woo read it. At Mr. Moon's words, Juho read the sentence out loud, "I'm a person who eats baguettes frequently. Even when I came to Korea on a trip, I had more baguettes than kimchi stew, so I think I might as well have gone to France instead." It was a strange and awkward sentence. Look at this sentence. It's hard to tell what it's trying to say because it's lengthy and awkward, right? I'm running out of breath. It kind of feels awkward. I can feel his stream of consciousness. Juho looked at the word baguette. Something isn't quite adding up here. When a beginner tries to write a longer sentence, this is the result they end up with. That's why longer sentences are harder to work with. Even authors go through several polishing processes when they're writing a lengthy sentence. As for you guys, get used to writing shorter sentences. Mr. Moon wrote another sentence on the side of the chalkboard. I eat baguettes frequently. Even when I visited Korea, I had more baguettes than I had kimchi stew. If I had known better, I would have gone to France. I'm sure it would have been a much better trip. The sentence was still filled with baguettes, but it was definitely more organized. Even dividing up the sentence into segments made a big difference. There was room to breathe, and Juho thought about what might come next. He stacks a lot of bad memories on his visit to Korea. In the end, he leaves for his dream destination, France. Will he be able to build better memories? Only good memories. That's no fun. Let's make it worse. At that moment, Juho heard Mr. Moon's voice. I'll give you another example. The subject is baguette. Juho had an idea of what Mr. Moon had had for lunch. Unlike Juho, who was resting his chin on his hand, everyone else listened intently. Sun Hwa was especially focused. Seeing him creating an organized, easy-to-read sentence out of a jumbled-up mess made her remember that Mr. Moon was really a teacher after all. When he taught a class, it was obvious that Mr. Moon had no desire to teach. He never went out of his way to teach. He only did the bare minimum. His class came to an end after he covered what was going to be on the test. Even when it came to deciding what was going to be in the test, Mr. Moon would always refer to an older teacher who was more experienced. His attitude was completely different. Anybody could have complained if they saw such a drastic difference in Mr. Moon's attitude when teaching. Hey, this is discriminatory. Then, he would answer without a care in the world, I hate school. I hate working. I'm proud that I even come out. Since it wasn't like Mr. Moon rejected students with questions or skipped teaching his class, no one would be able to punish him, and he would proudly walk about school. Try revising your papers like I taught you. Whatever you don't finish will be your homework. Yes, Mr. Moon. The club members spent their entire weekend facing their embarrassing past, cutting and taking out words and phrases. Juho, too, was keeping himself busy. He was so occupied that he didn't even hear the door opening. A hand suddenly appeared next to him, and Juho traced his eyes up along the hand. It was his mother. Have some fruit. Okay, thanks. His mother said as she put down a plate of apple slices. She looked at her son with a delighted heart. Juho hadn't squandered the money or become conceited about his own talent. For that, his mother was proud of her son. She left the room to let her son focus, and Juho put a piece of apple into his mouth and concentrated all the more. He split up certain parts, elaborated in certain places and enhanced the weaker areas in his writing. He toned down the parts that were too dense. Juho was revising his paper so that it was sharp and solid. As he busily moved his pen, he suddenly stopped. Should it be, he chokes on a piece of boiled carrot? There wasn't much that could be done with such a bizarre ending. Besides, Juho kind of liked it. It resembled the recklessness of youth. It was rash, but brave at the same time. It was an ending that was both bold and unfaltering, which wasn't common in recent books. I'll leave it alone. Juho examined the next page. At that moment, his phone vibrated on his bed. He had tossed it onto the bed on his way in. The call was from Nam Kyung, and Juho answered. Hello. Hey, Juho. Are you busy? I can talk. What's up? Nam Kyung called him from time to time to check in with him or give him an update on book sales or any recent developments. It wasn't out of place for him to be calling. Yet, Juho was getting an unusual vibe from Nam Kyung's voice. It sounded like he was excited. Did something happen? Juho asked, to find out what was happening. You know the author, Dong Gil right? Of course he knew. Juho had bought one of his books from the bookstore not too long ago. It had been a good read. Of course I know him. So, he contacted me. He contacted you. He wants to meet you. Excuse me. He says he's dying to know what you look like. What do you say, should I set up a meeting? There was a brief silence. Dong Gil wants to meet me just because he wants to know what I look like. Even in midst of confusion, he calmly analyzed the situation. That had never happened before. He had never met Dong Gil so there was no reason for him to reach out to Juho. One thing that had been different from the past was that Juho had remained anonymous this time. Dong Gil was saying that he wanted to know what Juho looked like. In the past, it would have been as easy as searching the internet if he had wanted to find that out. This time, however, it was different. There was no way to know what Yunwoo looked like. If Dong Gil was curious about Juho's face, then the only way was to meet him in person. How interesting. Whenever things played out differently from the past, Juho felt relieved at heart. It meant that he was not repeating the mistakes of the past. Taking a deep breath, he answered Nam Kyung. Juho had enjoyed reading Dong Gil's book as an adult. Even when he couldn't write a single decent sentence, his appreciation for the author had remained unchanged. It can't hurt to meet him, Juho thought. Sure. I'm free throughout the weekend. Sooner the better. Will the actual meeting happen sometime next week? He thought. Come now. Nam Kyung said over the phone as if he were reading Juho's thoughts. The end. Chapter 27. A harsh, bitingly cold winter. 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 27. Chapter 27. A harsh, bitingly cold winter. 2. Translator. Editor. Translated by Sean Su. Edited by Sudi Owl. It was around here somewhere. Juho was lost. He had to leave in a hurry because of a last-minute plan. Though he managed to get to the vicinity of the publishing district, the sheer number of book cafes around made it difficult to find the meeting place, so he took out his phone to ask Nam Kyung for directions. He followed the directions on the phone and went into an alley. Hey, I'm here. Nam Kyung was waving his hand in front of a building. It was a cafe where the front was made entirely of glass. The blue sign met Juho's eyes. I didn't think you'd ask me to come out so soon. Mr. Is a man of action. Right. Juho was able to tell from how he had asked for a meeting. He and Nam Kyung went into the cafe. The books inside caught his eyes. That book cafe was putting more emphasis on the book aspect than others. It had to be because it was within the publishing district. Looking around, Juho found a man who looked to be in his 30s. He was sitting with a straight posture, writing. He was focused. The blank expression on his face gave off a slightly rigid impression. That must be him, Dong Gil. As expected, Nam Kyung walked toward the man. Mr. This is Yun Woo. At Nam Kyung's voice, the man stopped his hand and slowly raised his eyes to Juho's face. Then, he stared intently for a little while and said, How you doin', sir? Although Juho was much younger, Dong Gil greeted him with respect. Juho said hello and told him not to worry about having to be polite. Dong Gil accepted without saying much else. He really was a man of action. I'm Juho Woo. I prefer Juho rather than Yun Woo. Sure. Nam Kyung suggested ordering something to drink, and all three decided on hot Americanos. They sell cakes by the slice. Would you like one? I'll eat gratefully. With a satisfied smile, Nam Kyung ordered 2 slices of cake. Dong Gil had respectfully declined Nam Kyung's offer because he was not into sweets. Soon, the cakes and Americanos came out. Juho ate his cake while Nam Kyung caught up with Dong Gil. Everything was delicious. Once they finished, Dong Gil turned his eyes to Juho. Juho took that as a cue and started a conversation. I've heard you were curious about my looks. Dong Gil admitted, yes. I was surprised at how young you were. Now that I see you in person, you do look your age. I enjoyed your work quite a bit. Juho thanked him with a smile. It felt pretty good to be complimented by a famous author who had written several best-selling books. He would probably continue to write more in the future. I've read quite a bit of your books myself. Is that right? I figure they might have been a little serious for a student. That was true. Dong Gil's books were definitely more serious, perhaps to a fault. However, Juho preferred such books. I'm also a fan of Hemingway. Dong Gil's rigid face loosened up a bit. Hemingway is a great author. He's in my list of things that I clearly like. I have it in my notepad. Juho blinked for a second. Clearly what? What's in that list? It's a list of things that I clearly like. It was just as he said. Juho thought of his first encounter with Dong Gil when he walked into the cafe and asked, "So, were you working on that list before I got here?" That was a journal. He wrote quite a bit. It explained why he was an author. Isn't it a little early for journaling? It's my journal, so I decide when I write it. He had a point. Among authors, there were some who were in the habit of journaling. In the case of Dong Gil, his rigid expression and journaling made for an interesting concoction. It suited him well. A man in his 30s who journals, how unique. Besides, what's with that list? Juho had never heard of such a list. Why is he writing a list like that? What makes you write a list like that? I wanted to know what I clearly like. Do you like things to be clear? Cut. Whether I like or dislike something is besides the point here. I'm just trying to get to know myself better. Juho was reminded of the old saying, know thyself. Are you into Socrates? I don't dislike him. It seemed like Dong Gil was much more unusual than Juho had imagined. During a brief pause in their conversation, Juho took the opportunity to take another bite of his cake, and Dong Gil brought his cup to his mouth. Do you remember your very first Hemingway experience? Dong Gil asked. Juho took some time to think until the cake in his mouth had slid past the back of his tongue. It didn't take much to remember his first experience with Hemingway's unique style, and he remembered being amazed by it. It was a short story called The Killers. That one's particularly hard. Boiled. I know. That's why I remember it so distinctly. I had never come across a book with such little emotional description. The story was part of a compilation. 2 contract killers attempted to murder a person. It was an irrational situation. There were 3 people who found out about it. One was indifferent toward it because it had nothing to do with him. Another accepted it as normal. Finally, the last person resisted. The person who chose to resist was named Nick. Nick found the person who the killers were after and explained the situation to the targeted man. However, the man refused to move from his place. He said, "I'm exhausted." Nick was shocked by that turn of events, and decided to leave town. When Juho read this simple story, he thought about the perspective of each character. He joined in with Nick in his resistance. He waited for the killers alongside the man who had let go of everything. Juho tried taking a step back like the first person and also tried to kill a person while embracing such irrational culture. Everything was possible. That was Hemingway. He was impressive. Dong Gil must have had a similar experience. What was your first Hemingway book? Juho asked him. The Snows of Kilimanjaro. Hemingway wrote the book after his trip to Africa. Dong Gil's eyes sparkled, and he continued, when I learned that, it felt like I had figured out the secret behind the liveliness of that book for the first time. In the novel, he reflected quite a bit on his own experiences. Dong Gil nodded. That's right. A crush, for example. A farewell to arms. One time, he went to Spain to witness the Spanish Civil War. For Whom the Bell Tolls. All of his books were titled after his real-life experiences. Dong Gil seemed satisfied by Juho's answer. He must have been happy that they spoke the same language. Perhaps, he was not such a complicated person after all. Dong Gil continued with a satisfied look on his face. Even the conciseness in his writing comes from his experience as a journalist. He's a person who uses his own life experiences as a basis for his books. Dong Gil described his impression of Hemingway as a person who wastes nothing. He was the same way. Hemingway felt like a person who would come up with a strange list to write in his spare time. Speaking of which, weren't you a journalist in the past, Mr. Having been listening to the conversation, Nam Kyung chimed in. Juho had never heard that Dong Gil used to be a journalist. It would have been a well-known fact if he had been. Juho thought that his rigidity somehow suited him for the job. A journalist or a reporter could give off a negative impression currently, but the job had always been about delivering the truth. It's an embarrassing past. How did you know? I met with Mr. On once for a manuscript request. That buddy of mine is always going around saying silly things. He has such a mushy style of writing. It's like he modeled it after his own personality. I don't feel good whenever I read his things. Is that right? I enjoyed it quite a bit. His criticism had an edge to it. As if he had been used to Dong Gil's personality, Nam Kyung responded in the blink of an eye. Dong Gil seemed much too genuine in his disgust to think that he was joking. What's Mr. On like? He wears sweatpants all year round. He has an underdeveloped sense of fashion. It didn't seem like Dong Gil had anything nice to say about his friend. Juho decided to stop asking any more questions. On the other hand, Nam Kyung was laughing as if he were amused by the joke. Juho changed the subject. I didn't know you used to be a journalist. I don't tell anyone on my own. He did say he was embarrassed about it. While Juho hesitated to speak, he thought, what makes one embarrassed of having been a journalist? Dong Gil continued as if it weren't a big deal. I started working as a journalist, but then I quit the next day. Then, Juho asked without hesitating, how come? It made sense for it not to be a widely known fact. Quitting the next day would mean that he had left before he even got his employee ID. Well, I have my reasons, but in the end, I saw myself quitting in the future. I felt like I was suffocating because it was very boring. I thought I might as well make better use of my time. I became a journalist because there is no money in writing books nowadays, but that was a mistake. I didn't prioritize myself in my decision. Then he continued confidently, no matter how time changed, I learned that I had the ability to survive. I was young too. I did a disgraceful thing by being afraid for no reason, bringing myself down. This doesn't mean that I support this biased society. Despite what he said, Juho wasn't getting an impression that he was arrogant. He described himself as if he were stating the obvious. For a best-selling author, his self-evaluation was not excessive in any way. He tried hard to understand himself objectively. That was it. He was not like Hemingway. You're not like Hemingway, Juho thought out loud. Dong Gil stopped talking for a moment. After a brief silence, he asked, what does that mean? He had a habit of exaggerating things to cover up his weak, timid personality. In that case, Dong Gil was definitely nothing like Hemingway. Hemingway was legendary for his binge drinking and pretentious attitude. Dong Gil smirked almost like a sigh. For a brief moment, his face seemed like that of a child who had lost his innocence. Yes, that's right, he murmured. I discovered that when I was about your age. I had never been so disappointed, even when I read Across the River and Into the Trees. Among Hemingway's books, Across the River and Into the Trees was one that was not well received by critics and fans. When I heard somebody describe him as a hairy sissy obsessed with masculinity, I was genuinely hurt. Maybe even more than Hemingway himself. Hemingway's mother had always wanted a daughter. For that reason, she had dressed her son in girly clothes. There was even a story of her introducing her son to the neighbors as Ernestine. As a means of rebelling against her, he would often go out hunting and fishing. He habitually demonstrated his masculinity. That was the beginning of his pretentious character. His concise writing style was revolutionary at the time. Though they seemed easy read on the surface, every book was thoroughly calculated. It was beautiful. That was the reason why Dong Gil had assumed that Hemingway had a personality like that of his writing style. After countless people testified that he was a big talker, I didn't know what to think. I couldn't help but feel betrayed. My sensitivity would not leave me alone. I had wanted to be like him, but I didn't want to be like him anymore. In the past, Dong Gil had spent a lot of time wondering about in life and figuring out his identity. At that moment, he took a notepad out of his chest pocket. That's why I started making this list, the list of things that I clearly like. It all made sense. His desire to judge himself objectively was coming from his past disappointment. Who would have known that there was such a story behind that strange list of his? Once a delusion shattered into pieces, another truth revealed itself. The truth was painful. It was difficult to accept. Yet, in the end, he ended up pursuing this same truth, and that was because he still looked up to Hemingway. What was the first thing you wrote on the list? Juho asked. Hemingway, Dong Gil answered. Juho spoke out a phrase that came to mind, a man can be destroyed, but not defeated. Old Man and the Sea, Dong Gil quietly named Hemingway's very last masterpiece. It was a phrase said by the protagonist of the book. To protect his once-in-a-lifetime catch, an old man named Santiago was fighting off sharks with his life. Then he said, a man can be destroyed, but not defeated. He was a man who would rather be destroyed than defeated. The sun shone brightly onto the 3 syllables written on Dong Gil's notepad. Chapter 28. A harsh, bitingly cold winter. 3. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 28. Chapter 28. A harsh, bitingly cold winter. 3. Translator. Editor. Translated by Sean Su. Edited by Sudiao. Now, let's talk about you, Dong Gil said as Juho took a sip of his lukewarm coffee. It was sudden, but it wasn't a surprise. That meeting had been set up for Dong Gil and Juho from the start. Juho learned how unique of a person Dong Gil was. Now, it was his turn. Didn't you want to know what I looked like? Juho asked light-heartedly. I did, but that was until I met you. I wanted to know what makes you look like a genius. I'm not sure if I am one. Speaking of which, you wrote the novel called The Genius, right? I did. It was about a genius who was born in a time that wasn't quite ready to welcome him. He eventually falls into ruin. He starved to death in the end. The Genius was written entirely in the first-person perspective. The protagonist was a pianist who came from a poor family. He was also a genius. He was recognized for his skills and received a special scholarship to a music school. Unfortunately, without personal connections or wealth, there was no chance for him to prove himself at that school. In the end, the protagonist left the school and made a living performing on the streets. Sadly, he failed to draw attention and met with a tragic demise. In his final performance, he resented his gift of music as his life slowly faded away. You've read it. I have. At Juho's short answer, Dong Gil showed him the back of his notepad. There, it was written. The list of things I clearly dislike. What do you know? If there was a list of things he clearly liked, Juho had wondered if there was also an opposite version of it. Unlike the positive version that started at the front of the notepad, that list started at the back. I wrote genius on top. It wasn't really necessary for him to show that. As a proof, Dong Gil put his notepad in front of Juho's face. The word genius was definitely on it. Underneath was hairs of a beast. I'm not a genius, so obviously, it makes me sick whenever I'm around one of those arrogant bastards. They think they're so talented. They make me want to shut them up. That's why I starved the protagonist to death, Dong Gil said bitterly as he imagined the protagonist of The Genius walking down the path of destruction. To him, there was nothing positive about the word genius. His physiological response was to deny them. As a writer, he couldn't help but to express such feelings in his writing. Whether somebody's a genius or a criminal, everyone's equal before starvation. That's true. They're human at the end of the day. Seeing these geniuses dying so tragically, it makes me wonder if God is as twisted as I am, he said confidently with a blank expression and continued looking at Juho. What do you think? If somebody like me were a god, a genius like you wouldn't possibly be able to live happily ever after. His tone was dry, and Juho thought, he might be right. If God really hates geniuses, then it makes sense that my life ended the way it did. Juho had lived such a life because he had been hated by God. He had become drunk with his own talent and stopped trying. He had been trapped within his own world and glorified himself as the king. If God was anything like Dong Gil, Juho would have certainly infuriated him. Yet, Juho came back. He had been given a second chance and he was still living. In that case, I quit being a genius. There's no other way than to quit. At Juho's answer, Dong Gil's jaw dropped ever so slightly. It had been a completely unexpected answer, and soon, he started smirking. You're a strange one. Am I? Very. As he muttered, Dong Gil wrote something in his notepad. You're one to talk, thought Juho. Genius. He had created a character and then called him a genius. Had that been appropriate? I didn't think the protagonist was a genius. What? Juho spoke his mind. He had been wanting to say that since a moment ago. The talent of a genius is bound to charm people, no matter the time and place. In any situation, that talent shines even if the genius is approaching death. The talent is merciless even to the one who possesses it. If the protagonist really were a genius, others around him wouldn't have let him starve to death. There was no boundary in the fairness of talent. It was equally cruel to everyone. Juho had talent, and whoever possessed a talent was often referred to as a genius. People called Juho genius, and he had thought it would last forever. Yet, he had eventually experienced failure, and there had no longer been anyone calling him a genius. Though praised as a gifted author at one point, Juho had left the literature field. On the other hand, Dong Gil, who denied his talent, continued writing. At the rock bottom of his life, Juho read Dong Gil's books and laughed. His success does not come from his talent, thought Juho. Then, his failure was probably not going to have anything to do with his talent either. Juho's failure hadn't been for lack of talent. The protagonist in the book was the same. The protagonist is not a genius. He envied talent and was ashamed of putting in the effort. That's why you starved him to death, right? He was merely envious of talent. He didn't put in the effort. He had never fought to obtain it. He simply sank deeper into the depths. There was no resistance. He didn't bother trying to live. He didn't want to eat. No wonder he had starved to death. After listening quietly, Dong Gil's mouth opened, and he said, "You seem very convinced. There's always a handful of people who find out, no matter how well I hide it. There's no reward in having secrets because of those people." Dong Gil was aware of how magnificent a talent could be. It was like a gem that shone on its own without sunlight. On its own, it had the ability to charm people. He had come to learn that he didn't have such a thing. A youngster who picked up a pen much later than Dong Gil had written something that exceeded his expectations. He remembered his first experience with Juho's writing. His heart had pounded aggressively. But I started first. I wrote so much more. Talent had been cruel to Dong Gil. To him, there was nothing more unfair. Figure of speech was not one of Dong Gil's strengths. He couldn't write anything fancy or magnificent and he wrestled with his weaknesses. Then, he discovered Hemingway and received help from his writing. Let's keep it simple, cutting out whatever's unnecessary. I'll write something simple and to dot the dot point, just like my savior, Hemingway. Everybody wants to be a genius, myself included at one point. As a young man, Dong Gil had wanted to be a genius. That had been why he had starved the pianist to death. Although it had been a shameful past, he hadn't wanted to neglect it. For that reason, he had hid it deep within his writing. He had pretended to be clueless to the questioning critics. Yet, of all occasions, this youngster, who had just quit being a genius, had found out about his secret. Dong Gil remembered the face of a friend who had discovered his secret immediately, just like Juho did. It was aggravating, but Dong Gil found himself smiling for some reason. "Give me your number, now," Dong Gil said forcefully as he took out his cell phone out of his chest pocket. "Hello." Dong Gil heard a cracked voice over the phone. That pathetic fellow must have been sleeping until that time. The sun was setting. It was obvious that he had been binge-watching dramas that he hadn't been able to watch while he had been writing. Ednel.co Dong Gil said, "Come out." "Come out where?" "I just woke up, man. I'm still half asleep. I'm going back to bed. I just met Yun Woo." Thump. Thud. It sounded like something fell on the floor. Dong Gil could picture the man's messy room. From A to Z, there was nothing to like about that guy. Then, the friend on the phone answered with an excited voice, "Should I go to that restaurant?" "Yep." Dong Gil got in his car and headed toward the restaurant he went to frequently with his friend. It was a mediocre place, both in taste and price, but they went regularly because of its convenient location. Seo Jung-on hated going out with a passion, especially somewhere far. Dong Gil lived in the same neighborhood, and it was also convenient for him to stay close to home. For that reason, they made themselves regulars at that restaurant. After parking his car nearby, Dong Gil went into the restaurant. There was a man wearing a black sweatshirt and pants. His untidy, bed-headed appearance made it obvious that he had just gotten out of bed. Dong Gil cringed at the sight. Upon seeing Dong Gil, the man raised his hand up and waved. "I'm here. Put your hand down. I can see you." After taking their seats, the two ordered a couple bowls of noodle soup. "Man, you finally met him. I applaud your quick-to-act attitude. So how was it?" "Woman. Man. Do you have a picture?" He was making a big fuss. On purpose, Dong Gil parted his lips as slowly as possible. "Yun Woo is a boy. I don't have a picture of him." "Why not?" "Because. Whether I take one or not is up to me." The food had made its way onto their table. As he slurped on the noodles, Seo Jung asked, "So, did you rip the young genius a new one?" "Nope. He ripped me a new one." "What?" "The infamous Dong Gil let a boy rip him a new one." "Who are you calling infamous?" At the unamusing title given by his friend, Dong Gil expressed annoyance. Seo Jung waved his hand at his friend, a gesture meant to express that there were more important things. "Hurry up. Tell me more. I'm dying to know." Seo Jung looked like he'd throw a temper tantrum, like a child if he didn't get what he asked for. To prevent it from happening, Dong Gil calmly told his friend of his encounter with Juho. Juho Woo. He was a type who would calmly munch on his cake amid bolts out of the blue. "He quit what?" A 17-year-old said that. "Yes, he did. I ended up writing it on my notepad without even thinking." Dong Gil opened the front part of his notepad. There were 3 syllables written there. Juho Woo. With his eyes on that not-so-funny list, Seo Jung said with a serious face, "So, he did have what it takes to write something like that, after all." Dong Gil nodded. Before Juho's book had even come out, the furor that had already spread across the publishing industry was. There's an author making his debut at the age of 16. Frankly, Dong Gil had paid no attention. He clearly remembered picking up Juho's book with a cynical smile. However, the reality was not what he had thought. Until he read the book himself, Dong Gil hadn't realized that he had been underestimating that author because of his age. The Trace of a Bird was about a boy who was afraid of birds. He only left his house at night and wandered the streets. That was when all of the birds were asleep. It was pure. It had literary value. Yun-woo knew how to control his emotions. It was hard to believe that a 16-year-old had written a book like that. I hadn't cried like that from reading in years. There wasn't necessarily a sad part in the book. Nobody died or got into an accident. The boy just faced the rising sun at the end. It was such a simple scene. Yet, Dong-gil had been moved to tears. We must have looked ridiculous. Two older men, crying their eyes out, each with a book in their hands, Seo-jung said as he snickered. Why did it have to be at my place? What was I supposed to do? My mom wanted me to bring you some food. I wanted to eat while I was at it too. Back then, Seo-jung had gone over with a book in one hand and a bundle of food on the other. He had been wearing blue at the time. I guess there was nothing to worry about all along. What do you mean? Seo-jung asked with a piece of kimchi in his mouth. If he's that much of a character, I'm thinking we can expect him to write another book. Think about it. Everyone's going crazy around him. Wouldn't you be overwhelmed? I would have hid on an island somewhere. Weakling. Though Dong-gil answered bluntly, he had thought the same. At one point, he too had thought that he might never see another book from Yun-woo. That author had definitely had a bad start. He had become way too successful, way too young. A leaf was most vulnerable when it was freshly sprouted. Dong-gil had believed that until he met Juho in person. It's possible. We should be on our toes. Seo-jung's eyes moved calmly. It was extremely rare for him to be nervous. However, Dong-gil couldn't help but agree. We should. Chapter 29. With all his heart, 1, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 29. Chapter 29, With all his heart, 1, translator. Editor. Translated by Sean Su. Edited by Sudiaol. After a quick breakfast, Juho changed into his uniform and left for school. When he arrived to class, he either read a book or a text in the English textbook. Occasionally, he would stare out of the window or go up to the second year's floor to chat with Baron. That day was no different. Juho looked at the text in his English textbook. It was about dreams. The textbook was referring to none other than future careers. It wasn't about dreaming in one's sleep or dreaming of something in one's life. He thought of a conversation he had with Seo Kwang not too long before. What would it be like to be a novelist? Seo Kwang asked. He sounded excited for some reason. Juho gave him a brief stare and asked, Is that what you want to do? I just happened to find myself enjoying being part of the literature club, a lot more than I had expected. It was true. He did seem much happier as of late. A novelist, huh? It suited him. If that's what your heart desires, then so be it. I support you. I haven't really decided yet. Although he answered vaguely, Seo Kwang's eyes were sparkling. What is it? Though it was a day just like any other, Juho had been thinking that something had been different. Seo Kwang had been acting strange as of late. He had felt Seo Kwang staring daggers at him for some time. He had blatantly turned around with the backrest in between his legs. As a person who sat directly behind him, Juho was feeling rather uncomfortable. What? He scratched his cheek. It almost felt like it was stinging. Why are you looking at me like that? You think I'm cute? In spite of Juho's light-hearted joke, Seo Kwang's face remained completely still. Usually, he would have, at the very least, made a complete fool out of Juho. This world really is kind of unfair. With that mysterious remark, Seo Kwang turned back to his desk. Juho muttered as he stared into the back of Seo Kwang's head, was it really about my looks? He briefly looked at his reflection on the window and thought, it's not half bad. When recess started, Seo Kwang asked a question out of nowhere, where did you say you lived? Confused, Juho tilted his head. It really was a random question. After telling Seo Kwang the location, he asked, why do you ask? Just because. You don't live that far from me. It's all in the same neighborhood. My side tends to be hillier though. This neighborhood was on a mountain, so there were a lot of hills even in the residential areas. There was also a mountain right behind the school. He was met with the cries of turtle doves on his way to school in the morning, and with hikers on his way back. It was like a countryside neighborhood within Seoul. Can I come over? There was no reason Seo Kwang couldn't. Sure. My parents are out for work. You want to come today? No. Later. Juho nodded light-heartedly, but there was something about Seo Kwang's attitude that bothered him. Maybe he got himself into some sort of trouble. The next morning, he had to open his eyes at the sound of the doorbell. Ding, dong. It rang once again as he lingered in his blanket. It was rushing him to get out of bed. Soon, he realized that he was the only person around. Every weekend, Juho's parents would make a trip out to the countryside to look for a house. They had been telling him that they would put the city life behind them once their son grew up into an adult. Without any objection, he accepted his parents' future plans. After all, no one could live life for another person. Not answering the intercom, for example. It wasn't until after a stretch and a yawn that Juho came out of his room and closed the door behind him. Half asleep, he looked at the intercom screen and saw a familiar face. Why is it that you're ringing my doorbell? He asked over the intercom. Hey, buddy, I said I'd come over. It's kind of sudden actually. Didn't you get my text? I was asleep, thought Juho. Because he hadn't gone to bed until late, he had been sound asleep well into the morning. Don't people usually wait for a response? I brought fried chicken. Juho opened the door. The smell of fried chicken filled the entire house as soon as Seo Kwang walked in. Since he got out of bed late, Juho was hungry, yet too lazy to cook something. That was perfect. Seo Kwang had read his mind. Juho sat Seo Kwang down as he looked around curiously. He went into the bathroom to wash his face, and then joined Seo Kwang for brunch. The box contained half chicken, half fried, half marinade. After pouring Coke into the cups, Juho and Seo Kwang each picked up a drumstick. Let's eat. This place knows their chicken. It was just as Seo Kwang said. It was delicious. As the two ate, they spent time on small talk like what the best part of a chicken was or which place delivered the fastest. Soon, there were nothing but bones inside the box. Then, Seo Kwang saw the bookshelves filled with books in the living room and said, "You have quite a few books too." My parents read a lot as well, just like I do. I read something interesting recently. After starting the topic, Seo Kwang made his way into the kitchen to wash his hands. Juho had an idea of what Seo Kwang was about to say. He's probably going to talk about a book, he thought, and listened to Seo Kwang as he cleaned the table. There's this young psychologist who said that our inner selves occasionally reflect themselves onto the external things around us. Apparently, you can tell what a person is like on the inside by looking at his belongings or the traces he has left, kind of like Sherlock Holmes. Like insight. Yeah. Survival experts figure out the animal that is around them by looking at footprints or excrement left behind. It's the same for humans. You can't really find human excrement nowadays. Really? How do you say stuff like that after a meal? I have a strong stomach. Seo Kwang opened the windows to ventilate the house. When he opened a large window in the living room, a light breeze rushed into the house. With Juho standing behind him, he continued, "What I'm saying is that even if you stay one night at a hotel, you leave a trace of yourself. Apparently, you can figure anything out from personality, the life the person has lived, and his future plans. That's amazing. Is that how fortune telling works?" That, I don't know, answered Xiao Kuang. The point is that a space contains a lot of information about the person who has been there. A lot more than we think. He asked, is that your parents' room? Yep, Juho answered Xiao Kuang as he stood still. Xiao Kuang turned around from the direction he had pointed. Juho kept watching him from his place while Xiao Kuang raised his hand to turn the door handle. Of course. A breeze passed through when he opened the door, and Xiao Kuang murmured as he walked into the room, feeling the breeze. I knew it. I knew it would look like this, he thought. The room was filled with writing. There were piles of papers and boxes surrounding the bed, the desk and the other furniture. Xiao Kuang saw a corner of a page peeking through an opening in the box. All of the papers were filled with letters. They were all used up. Every space was filled with ink. It was almost overwhelming, even for a font fanatic like Xiao Kuang. Occasionally, there were things in the English alphabet, Chinese characters, and characters in mysterious languages. There were sentences made of signs he had never seen before. You must have wanted to see my room, Juho said from behind. He sounded calm and light-hearted. It was as if the room didn't belong to him. With a faint smile, Xiao Kuang opened his mouth and confessed, I saw your paper. Now it made sense as to why he had been acting so strange. He might have been someone who spent much more time reading than Juho, and Juho's eyes darkened. When you came in late to the science room. I was the first one there that day. There were 4 notebooks on the desk. There were written pages in each notebook. He continued as he reminisced, Sun Was was fun to read. Bombs was sentimental. And yours. He couldn't forget what he had read that day. The ending was disastrous, and the story itself wasn't all that long. Yet, the moment he read the first sentence, it became all too apparent that something was different. He had been reading books since he was a child. He had been reading from the time he learned how to read. Yun Wu's appearance was an incredibly exciting development. He couldn't believe that an author his age was capable of producing such work. His writing was pure, brilliant, and controlled. Xiao Kuang had been filled with joy. He couldn't have been happier that he was sharing time with such an author. Thinking that he would be able to read Yun Wu's book until he died, Xiao Kuang smiled even in his sleep. But your writing was different from Yun Wu's. It was proficient and fluid. It was heavy and cruel. There was depth in Juho's writing. There was no way to know how deep it could be, like a dark hole at the bottom of the ocean that could suck in any divers that came too close. As if he was met with a colossal existence, Xiao Kuang's instincts were getting intimidated. On the other hand, he was impressed. He was moved. If Juho wrote with all his heart, Xiao Kuang's experience would have been even more real. Your writing was different from Yun Wu's. Your skill was impressive. It was hard to imagine that it came from someone my age, but you were different. I'm sure it was. Juho was no longer the same as Yun Wu, the author of Trace of a Bird. When he came back to the past, he was able to remember what he had eaten the day before. He clearly remembered what it had felt like when he had been drowning in the river. It was the same for his writing style. It was a difficult task for an author to change his writing style. His writing was a direct translation of himself. It was as difficult as changing himself. Juho had gradually changed over the course of 30 years. As a result, his writing style had changed with him. Naturally, he would have forgotten his writing style from the time he wrote Trace of a Bird. Naturally. He had tried writing the day he returned to the past, and he had been able to write in both styles, the one from the time he wrote Trace of a Bird, and the one from the time he had written his past failures. It was for that specific reason that he had been able to join the literature club without hesitation. Even Mr. Moon couldn't suspect him to be Yun Wu. He remembered the day Xiao Kuang was referring to. It was the day he came to science room with Mr. Moon after meeting with James. I knew it. I thought somebody had moved my notebook, he thought. Seo Kwang apologized for looking into Juho's notebook without permission. However, Juho wasn't all that angry about it. It's fine. Seo Kwang was provoked by his unwavering voice. Are you Yunwoo's twin? That level of skill in your age, you must be related. Show me a family photo. I want to see if there's a person who looks exactly like you. Who are you if you're not his twin? What? Are you saying that the world is wide and full of geniuses? He let out an exhausted sigh. He looked around the room filled with stacks of paper. It would take him well over a year to write that much. He thought about what he had just said. Genius. As expected, he realized that he had fallen short. Genius alone would not be able to embrace Juho's talent in its entirety. Yunwoo had to be the same way. I enjoy being in the literature club. So naturally, I thought about becoming a novelist. But you know what, I changed my mind, he said light-heartedly. I'm not trying to blame you. I don't want to be a writer when there are people like you and Yunwoo. I'm sure a mere bookworm like myself would fall away eventually. He had no courage to make his room look like Juho's. Forfeiting was easy. He felt nothing. After all, it really had just been a passing thought. The end. Chapter 30. With all his heart, too. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 30. Chapter 30, With all his heart, too. Translator. Editor. Translated by Sean Su. Edited by Sudiao. You know, more than anything, I want to read your writing to my heart's content. Without any hindrance. I felt that more than the desire to be a novelist, Seo Kwang said with a smile. Juho had nothing to say to him. It was his choice. It was his decision. It must have been a difficult one at that. A novel couldn't be written simply because it had been requested. Unless the author himself was writing, the novel would not move onward even if it were being forced. Life was the same way. For that reason, he quietly listened to Seo Kwang venting. Once Seo Kwang stopped talking, there was silence. He hesitated for a moment, but soon started talking again in a slightly exaggerated voice. Can you do me a favor? Count it as payment for the fried chicken. What's the favor? Asked Juho. It was a gesture of acceptance. It's about the essay contest. The essay contest. Juho had forgotten about it. It was a contest in which there was only one winner at the end. Write with all your heart. Not that whack ending you wrote. I want to read the story that you write. Juho stared at him briefly and looked relieved. However, he wasn't happy to see such an expression, so he answered, I will, if you write with all your heart. Seo Kwang's eyes shook, and the moment turned with his light-hearted remark, you got it. It'll only cost you some fried chicken if you lose. Seo Kwang left Juho's house. The sun was setting, and a faint veil of darkness covered the sky. Everything around him looked depressing. Maybe it had something to do with the sun setting. Where are the streetlights when you need one? It wasn't dark enough for streetlights to come on as it was still bright enough for the people who were walking. He thought about Juho's room as he walked back slowly. He had never been to a place like that. It was a sight that inspired awe. It wasn't the amount of paper that was in the room, it was the effort, the passion towards something. It was something Seo Kwang didn't have. Soon, he stopped in his tracks. It's okay, he whispered. He didn't try like Juho did. He couldn't dare to. That was the extent of him trying. It was a good thing that he had given up on wanting to be a novelist. Well, I'll probably lose. He didn't know what he had been thinking when he challenged Juho. It had been almost entertaining. There's a limit to a bluff, he thought. It's fine. Even if I lose, it's only going to be fried chicken. Besides, I had some today. It's okay. It's just fried chicken. Damn it. He clenched his fist out of the anger welling up within. Struggling to stand still, he stood in the middle of the street for a while. Tomorrow. The time flowed even if one sat completely still. Juho was lying on his bed. If he went to sleep as he was, the next day would inevitably come, along with the essay contest. The contest was finally happening. It felt like it had been just the day before that Mr. Moon had made the bet with the club members. Since then, everyone in the club had been writing daily, excited for fried chicken. They collected words and revised, repeatedly. Yet, all that effort wasn't necessarily equivalent to special training for the contest. As per usual, the members randomly chose a topic and wrote accordingly. That meant that the only thing they had to do was write, whether they were competing in a contest or not. If there was one thing better about the contest, it was that the contestants got to choose the topic they wanted to write about. Juho got up and leaned against the chair. It was dark out, and his family was asleep. There were remnants of the writing he had been working on up to a moment ago. He thought of Seo Kwang. When he had gone over, Juho hadn't seen him out. One reason for it had been that Seo Kwang had declined, but the main reason was the strange sensation in his hand by the time their conversation started coming to an end. It wasn't a foreign sensation. He would occasionally experience it before he started writing. When most people expressed their emotions in drawings, they often drew a heart near the chest. That was because whenever people were happy or sad, that was where it hurt. In the same way, Juho assumed the sensation in his hand to be coming from his heart. A feeling that I could almost touch. Except, from time to time, the sensation would move toward the center of his hand. The sensation would spread across his palm and make it itchy and painful at the same time. To free himself from it, Juho instinctively reached for his pen. That wasn't according to his will. Just as he had no control over his heartbeat, he had no choice but to write. That day had been no different. After Seo Kwang left, Juho went back into his room and started writing. He grabbed whatever paper came into his grasp and began to write. It was impulsive, poorly written trash. He let out a faint sigh. Seo Kwang had asked him a favor, to write with all his heart, and that he wished to read what he wrote. Can I really do this? When he read Juho's paper, Seo Kwang thought Juho had intentionally ruined his ending, but that wasn't true. He had not intended on making up such an end. Unlike his personality, he was impulsive. He couldn't write anything if he wasn't in the mood. On the other hand, when he's at the peak of his inspiration, the only way to relieve the tension in his heart was to write. It was an annoying quality to have. If that tendency flared up during the contest, it would be impossible to write anything, let alone a story that his friend was dying to read. That's a problem. It was embarrassing to be called out for not putting in the heart. It wasn't easy to find somebody who loved books as much as Seo Kwang. They spoke the same language. Besides, the idea of disappointing his friend did not sit well with him. Can I do this? He asked himself. I'll only find out tomorrow. Then, I should just go to bed. It doesn't seem like I'll get much out of thinking all night. It'll only cloud my mind, he thought to himself. The next morning, he woke up after dreaming about being crushed to death by an alien monkey who had invaded the Earth. Unfortunately, he wasn't in the best of moods. You all look excited. We get out early today. Hooray for the essay contest. Everyone at school was much more lively during the morning assembly. It wasn't just Juho's class, but the entire school was boisterous. The essay contest was to take place during the morning periods. After that, everyone was going to be released. The entire school was excited by the idea of leaving early. Some students had already started making plans to go to karaoke with friends. It was as if the contest had been set aside. Not a lot of people seemed to be interested in the contest. That's better for us. The literature club will take over, Seo Kwang said with a smile. You never know who you're going to be competing against, said Juho. Xiao Kuang scoffed and answered confidently, no way. Even if there was somebody with awe-inspiring writing skills, it's not a big deal. He seemed to be about twice as excited as his usual self. Then, Juho realized that he became talkative when he was nervous. Who dares challenge the literature club? We'll accept it any day, he said boisterously, though it was buried by the entire school getting excited. Some students had already started thinking about what to write. Just as a true master lived in hiding, there was no telling what kind of monstrous writers would be competing. After all, life always steered toward unexpected events. At that moment, the door opened, and a teacher walked in. It was someone familiar. It's Mr. M. Xiao Kuang welcomed him. The essay contest was a test in its own right, so each teacher had to be overseeing a class. In Mr. Moon's hand, there was a stack of large, gray, recycled paper. Although he gave no instructions, the classroom became completely silent. It was the students' reflex to prepare for an exam whenever there was gray, recycled paper. You didn't forget about my favor, did you? Xiao Kuang asked. He sounded calm, and Juho gave him a light nod. At that, Xiao Kuang turned around without hesitation, and Juho looked at his back. Here come the gray pages, he thought. Take one and pass it to the person behind you. You may begin as soon as you receive your paper. Juho took a deep breath as he listened to Mr. Moon's voice. Xiao Kuang handed the paper to him. There were squares on the large paper that almost covered the entire desk. In those squares, there were lists of topics to choose from. Teacher, parents, love, friendship, school, friends, Arbor Day, Independence Movement Day, etc. The list made it easy to realize that that was for a school essay contest. Juho found a word that was at the end of the list. It was radom, out of the blue. Plaster figure. Where did this come from? Maybe it was Mr. Moon's idea. Juho wondered about the look on the other teachers' faces. PFF, a faint snicker came from the front. Xiao Kuang had to have thought the same. Juho drew a circle around the word plaster figure. His hand had moved awkwardly, and the crooked circle was bothering him. He realized that he was completely incapable of concentrating in that moment. Other students whispered. They were asking each other what they were going to write about. Mr. Moon didn't really say much. It wasn't a strictly supervised environment. If anything, it was more like a festival. A festival. Juho pictured the fireworks of a grand festival. People marching with flashy lights walked between rows of crowds. There was uplifting music, and people were filled with excitement, just like the students in that classroom. Speaking of which, when was the school festival again? The school festival was usually prepared around the time after the second year's final exam. Juho didn't have any special memories of the school festival. It hadn't exactly been fun. What would the literature club do at the festival? Set up a writing experience booth. There probably won't be anybody interested. The club was already in a classroom that was out of sight. With a boring content like that, nobody would be interested. Actually, are we even doing something? He asked himself. The festival wasn't until much later, but he suddenly became curious. After thinking about various things about the festival, Juho shook his head. Now's not the time. Snap out of it. Gotta write, he reminded himself. He concentrated on thinking about images of plaster figures. Agrippa, Venus, Julian, Michelangelo, Hermes, Apollo, Kant. They were in all sorts of shapes and sizes. There was also a plaster figure in the art class in school. There were splashes of paint on its white, smooth surface. There were scribbles here and there, both written and erased. Her beautiful curves were stained with dark spots. If she were alive, she would have had much to complain about how she was being managed. When Juho thought about the ivory skin of a plaster figure, his mind naturally took itself to the story of Pygmalion. Pygmalion. It was the name of a sculptor who fell in love with one of his own sculptures. He stroked and kissed the sculpture. After desperate prayers, the sculpture finally became a real woman, and the two fell in love. Great, I'm going to read about mythology when I get home, he thought. Juho pinched his own forehead. I'm doing it again. The end.